I'm doing a series on my mantras of legal user experience. The series will culminate on Labor Day with the release of my subscription platform, BeBrief Plus. For more information, visit my website, bebrief.us. Before discussing my first mantra, Frame It Right, I'm going to talk for a few minutes about what these mantras are. These mantras are fundamental truths about advocacy. They are derived from principle, yet forged in practice. The purpose is to focus your thinking on the critical moments of advocacy. Lawyers will often say, it depends. In fact, it rarely depends. And when it does, when it really, truly, absolutely depends, there's usually a critical moment lying underneath or nearby. These moments are rare and often imperceptible, even in hindsight. That's because they take place long before ordinary intelligence has mapped out a description of the situation. The purpose of these mantras, then, is to help you develop the sensitivities needed to discover and then appreciate these critical moments. Most lawyers are too busy worried about everything but. And the problem isn't just that they miss these critical moments. The problem is that as these critical moments pass them by, they think they're killing it. They're checking off their to-do lists, they're billing hours, they're sending nasty letters. They're earning praise from superiors who've mortgaged their futures on business models that are unsustainable. Here's the principle. The more sensitive you become to these critical moments, the less you think it depends. You develop systems, you act in accordance with those systems, and you learn from those systems. Now, developing a sensitivity to these critical moments is hard enough on its own. But once you do so, things will start getting much harder for you. You'll become conscious of things that others do not and cannot see. You'll develop a deeper knowledge and understanding. You'll become increasingly compelled to have difficult conversations with colleagues. And you'll be compelled to make bolder strategic decisions. It'll become harder for you to do what others have always done. Harder for you to continue lowering your standards just so you can get out of the office at a reasonable time or avoid another round of red lines. These tensions will make it easy to think that ignorance is bliss, but it's not. Start solving these problems in your practice, and you'll future-proof your career. Start solving these problems in your relationships, and you'll future-proof your life. So here's my first mantra. Frame it right. Issue management is easily the most important thing you'll do as an advocate. It's important strategically, of course. You want to win. But it's also important personally. You want to be confident in the decisions you make. You want to do what Sun Tzu said, overcome your opponent and increase your strength to boot. Winning an argument or a point means nothing if it doesn't advance your cause. The more confident you are, the easier it is to handle stress or even bypass stress altogether. How much easier would your day-to-day be if you stopped reacting to everything your opponents do? If you stopped racing through emotions each time you got an ECF notification? If you could read a filing of your opponents and have your heart rate remain steady, if you could question a witness during a deposition and have your heart rate remain steady, how much easier would your practice be? Of course, your confidence must be rooted in reality, not fantasy. Frame it right, and you'll have a fighting chance to earn a decisive victory, one that might catapult your practice or career. You'll also have a fighting chance to make your law practice one that is both sustainable and enjoyable. A chance to emphasize the many benefits of our practice while minimizing the few but overwhelming downsides. If you don't frame it right, you'll have no chance to do any of these things. And you likely won't know any better. You'll remain the central character in a typical it depends practice full of stress and anxiety as you react to each thing that comes across your computer screen as though it were unique. You'll find yourself needing to ponder the consequences of everything before you take that call or respond to that email. And you'll continue thinking to yourself, well, that's just how it is. The importance of this mantra cannot be overstated. Its fundamentals transcend time. Sun Tzu wrote of strategic factors. He wrote, the general who determines victory at headquarters has the most strategic factors, while the general who relies on the incompetence or inability of opponents has the fewest. The general with the most factors will win. and the nature and extent of that victory will be in direct proportion to the breakdown of those factors. So how do you frame it right? Well, generally speaking, these are the wrong questions to ask. How you do things depends heavily on context. If I want to visit my brother and his family in San Francisco, I could fly, I could take a train, I could drive my car, I could rent a car. In theory, I could bike or walk, although I'll tell you, I won't, lie to you. I will not physically be able to do either of those things. But in theory, I could do any of those things. How I do that depends to a very large extent on my circumstances. Indeed, I have a 1-year-old son of my own at home, so I opt to FaceTime with my brother and his niece and his wife. All of these considerations are necessarily anchored in contemporary life. You know something, my grandparents flew only one time in their life. It was to see me as a baby when I was in Los Angeles and they were in Franklin Park. They never even had a microwave. So the how for my grandparents would be totally different than the how is for you with what you're doing. Law firms used to have libraries of books in their firms and in their offices. How you frame the issue is something you'll figure out. The question you need to ask as you do this is, what should I be considering as I frame the issues? So here's what's worked for me. Do this work at the beginning of your involvement in any engagement, whether it's a new matter or an existing matter. You need to take time at the outset to think. You need to think things through, and you need to think them over. Begin with jury instructions. Note which instructions are pattern instructions, which instructions require customizations. Where are there gaps in the instructions? I could hear you saying, but I do appeals, or I'm an arbitrator, or arbitration lawyer. I'm a deal lawyer. It doesn't matter. We all operate on the same terrain. As you consider the instructions, think of the types of facts, the evidence that might tilt the equities one way or another. Consider the facts and the law together as a cycle, not one at a time. Which facts are mutable? That is, which facts are subject to change, as Dodd and Posner would say. If your client is found with cocaine in the backseat of his car, might that in fact be baking powder? If not, it had better have come from a passenger or planted by a police officer or something. Your theory must accommodate that cocaine because it's an immutable fact, a fact that the jury will believe is true despite any effort at cross-examination or spin. Note that the practice of law is one of complete information. This is different than, for example, the game of poker. Imagine if you could see your opponent's hole cards. Of course, that would be cheating and unethical and wouldn't have a game. If you could see your opponent's hole cards, there would be a mathematically correct play everything you did. And so the aim in poker is to be as close to that mathematically correct play without knowing what your opponent's cards are, but discerning what they are. And also engaging in the deception necessary so that they don't know what your hand is. And then therefore they can't act in accordance with the mathematical best play. But ours isn't like that. It's a game of complete information. So you can figure out what your opponent's best theory is. You can figure out the best theories of every party of an interest, whether they're named as a party or just an entity that might have an interest. You need to consider these at least as much as you consider your own. Professor Garner has written extensively on issue framing, and he's pioneered the 75-word syllogistic technique. As soon as you can, try writing each issue in under 75 words. This will be an internal document. Professor Garner recommends doing this at the outset of any motion or brief, and that's fine practice, but you need to be doing this internally with every case you have, with every claim you have, every claim brought by an opponent, every claim that could be brought by an opponent, every claim you've brought, every claim you could bring. And you need to follow the syllogistic setup: legal premise, factual premise, conclusion, stated as a question, separate sentences. To get an issue under 75 words, you'll need to play with the variables and see which pieces are essential. If you actually do this, you'll note that this is both substantive, which law applies, which portions and provisions apply, which provisions of the insurance policy or of the contract apply. which facts are important. It's substantive, meaty stuff, but it's also stylistic. And in fact, the stylistic, which is what most lawyers just sweep to the side and don't consider, that's the most important thing. If you're going to get an issue in under 75 words, you're going to need to figure out how to refer to the law that governs. You're going to need to figure out how to refer to the framework of the test or the rule or the factors. You'll need to figure out how to frame the facts, how to state the facts. You're going to learn how to say things quickly and memorably. This is important because you're writing to humans. You'll also start to think of facts categorically rather than individually. You'll note which types of evidence might exist that might change the analysis. This is hard and invariably thankless work. Don't rely on the work of others, and certainly don't rely on the opinions of others. Recognize the corrosive nature of experience. It's hard to examine yourself when you succeed, or when you think you've succeeded. When you stop looking inward, the experience becomes corrosive. This is especially true if you're coming into a project that your colleagues have been working on for some time. They'll tell you, here's the issues, here's what you need to be focused on. We know because we've been doing this for 18 months. In all likelihood, they haven't seriously tested their arguments. Their thinking is corrosive and their experience on the case is corrosive. The consequences of poor planning are high for you individually. So don't worry about whether your client is going to pay for this work. Think of it like this. I mean, here's the principle here, okay? If you do this work now, at the outset of an engagement that you have, you'll get paid for it later. But if you don't do the work now, you'll pay for it later. And you'll pay for it in a very dark and bad way because you won't actually see it happening until it's too late, until many years and decades have passed of you acting a certain way. The world changes, and you can't make any moves to keep up with it. So, how will you know if you've framed it right? Here's a heuristic that I use. Think of the last time you prepared for a hearing on a motion or a brief that you worked on. As you reviewed the briefs, did you find yourself thinking, gosh, if I had known the opponent would have argued this, I would have reorganized it that way? Or, well, after having done all this work, I now know that the real issue is this. The real critical dispositive point is that. Would you have just slashed and eliminated a whole bunch of nonsense that nobody ever read? Would you have changed the tone and the rhetoric? If the answer to that is yes, to any extent, then you need to categorize that as a loss. And the nature and extent of that loss is measured by how much and what you would change. Now, perhaps you just remove some adverbs, stop taking shots at your opponent, stop saying things like, you know, the opponent unbelievably argues this terribly stupid thing, or how could this possibly be a disputed point, or, you know, the opponent concocts this theory, or, you know, in a last-ditch effort, they do. This is nonsense. This is just you indulging your own whatever it is, and then burdening both, you know, your opponents, but most importantly, your user, your judge. Those are relatively easy things to fix, though. If it's a major change, if you miss the important facts, if you miss the relationship of the facts and the law, you just missed issues, well, that's a bigger loss. It's important to note, you might win your hearing. You have a trial? One thing lawyers do best, they can take any result and spin it. They can market it to clients, they can market it to their colleagues, and probably to themselves as a victory. Don't do that. Between your ears, you got to categorize things as catalog these things as losses. Take time now to review. Do the work now, you'll get paid later. You don't do the work now, you're going to pay for it later. Now, maybe when you're preparing for hearing, as you read through those briefs, you start realizing how good of a job you did. You start nodding your head along as you're, you know, flipping through your briefs and reading them. Yeah. And you see your opponents floundering and struggling, and you're kind of licking your chops as this hearing comes up because you know that there's really nothing your opponent can do at this point. And in that case, you'll know you framed it right.